Hey class, welcome back. I hope you had a nice break, and we're going to get into chapter 17 today. There's a little bit of chapter 16 here as well when we're talking about some of the labor strikes. You'll find those key terms in chapter 16. So let's get started. Now, the headline of this chapter, the title of this chapter is Freedom's Boundaries. And so what we're talking about here is what types of boundaries to freedom are certain groups of people feeling in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century. So we're going to begin today by talking about labor and labor movements. So these are movements that are fighting for the rights of workers in the United States. And then we're going to move to talking about, we're going to return to the South, and we're going to return to talking about African Americans and how the different disenfranchisement movement is trying to take away voting rights from African Americans. We're also going to talk about Jim Crow laws in Plessy v. Ferguson. And then we're going to talk about some African American civil rights activists. Oftentimes when we think of civil rights activists, we think of Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or the 1960s, right, or the 1950s. But there were African American activists back in the 19th century as well. So we're going to give them a shout out today in our lecture. And then finally, we are going to end with talking about immigration at the turn of the 20th century. Who is immigrating at the turn of the 20th century into the United States? How are these immigration movements changing the nature of immigration law in the U.S.? So that's so this is chapter 17, part 1. Chapter 17, part 2 will be the next PowerPoint, and we will be talking about American imperialism in that chapter, in that PowerPoint. Okay, so as I said, we're going to begin by talking about labor and labor movements in the U.S. in the late 19th century. And in order to kind of set that up, we need to figure out, well, what's going on with labor? Why is there a problem, so to speak? So the first thing to keep in mind is that the nation is growing into a much more urban nation in the late 19th century, and you have lots of people moving to the cities, becoming wage earners, working in factories. Also, you have people coming from other parts of the world into the United States in the late 19th centuries to work in these factories as well. So you have this growing urban workforce. And these workplace conditions were very harsh. People were working very long hours, on average 12 hours a day. They made very low wages, anywhere from maybe $1 a week to less than that. And there were very dangerous work conditions. So people were often injured on the job. There was no sort of OSHA standards or any kind of safety standards when it came to the workplace. And finally, child labor was common in the United States. It was not explicitly legal, but it was also not illegal. And so people would oftentimes employ children as young as 7, 8 years old in these factories, and they would be required to work the same kind of hours as an adult. So you're talking about 6-day work weeks, sometimes 7-day work weeks, 12 hours a day, no type of social safety net. So if you lost your job, there was nothing like unemployment, or there was no workers' compensation insurance. Basically, people were at the whim of their bosses. If you worked in one of these factories, you could be fired for any reason. So you had no power, you had no voice as a worker. And not only that, you're working under these dangerous conditions, and you're stuck in this cycle of poverty. So that's what's happening in the city. In the country, what's happening is there's a gradual mechanization of farming and farming practices. And so this is going to raise the production level of the crops so that crops are going to be produced at a much greater and efficient rate. But at the same time, that also drops the crop prices. And so there's not as much of a need for farm laborers, humans, to work on the farms. And through this mechanization process, a lot of people are moving out of the rural areas into the city. The other thing that's a real problem in the country is poverty and illiteracy. There's still not very there's not a lot of accessibility to education in these remote areas of the country. Again, people are living in poverty conditions, a lot of sharecropping still going on throughout the country. And then a lot of the people that lived in these rural areas felt as if the government favored the urban populations over them. They felt like the government made laws that favored the urban populations, but kind of forgot about these rural communities. So people in the countryside are unhappy for one reason, people in the city are unhappy for one reason, for another reason, and all of this is going to cause labor upheavals and a big call for reform moving forward as we get into the 20th century. So in order to address these issues, these labor unions are going to form. And we're going to talk about one of the oldest labor unions in the United States, the Knights of Labor. They were founded, as you can see on the slide, in 1869 by a man by the name of Terence Powderly. And basically they first formed as a secret organization because it was very dangerous to organize groups of workers back in the mid-19th century. Again, you could be fired for absolutely no reason. So people were very protective of their jobs. But moving forward, they became a more public organization. Now, the Knights of Labor were very unique in that they allowed women to join their organization, and they also allowed African Americans to join. They allowed workers that were skilled and unskilled to join their organization. What they wanted to create was basically a union that was a universal brotherhood for all workers. They didn't like to strike. They very rarely went on strike unless they had the support of other unions to back them up. They preferred arbitration, which is like when you sit down and mediate and try to work out a solution to the problems, or boycotts. And boycotts are where you basically refuse to buy a certain product or something like that in order to send a message to the manufacturer. So the Knights of Labor were a real powerful force in the second half of the 19th century. They eventually will dissolve and they don't really make it into the 20th century, but they are a really important force for organizing some of these early labor movements. And they had this motto, and their motto was, "An injury to one is the concern of all." So you really get this sense of inclusiveness with the Knights of Labor, and again, very important at that time. On the other hand, you have the American Federation of Labor, or also known as the AFL. And the AFL is still around today. It's now the AFL-CIO. And this was founded in 1886 by Samuel Gompers, who will actually stay a leader of the AFL into the 20th century. Now, the primary difference between the AFL and the Knights of Labor in the 19th century was that the AFL only allowed skilled workers into their union. So you had to have a particular craft, a particular skill. The reason that was behind this was that if you were a skilled craftsman and you went on strike, that would send a real message to your employer, and it would hurt your employer more because it would be harder to replace you. So the AFL in many ways had a lot more leverage than the Knights of Labor, but they also weren't as inclusive. So they didn't allow women into their union. They didn't allow minorities into their union. But they were very powerful in that they did have a very strong union of skilled craftsmen. So these two labor unions will be the primary driving force moving forward. Also the American Railway Union, but that will be founded later on in the 1890s. But these two unions are really important to understand in terms of the different types of labor organizations for the 19th century. Okay, so now we're going to talk about an example of one of the first major railroad strikes in the country. In fact, the first general strike in the country happened in the summer of 1877 with the Great Railroad Strike. It lasted 45 days and it started very small. So this strike happened, it began on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the B&O Railroad. And this particular railroad is one of the oldest railroad companies in the United States. And as a result of the Depression of 1873, they began to cut the wages of their workers. And ultimately, they cut their wages by 10%, which was significant. And again, there was no protection for wages back then. There wasn't even a minimum wage. So there was nothing you could do about it if your employer decided to cut your wages. Your only recourse was to demonstrate or to strike or to protest that. So it begins with a group of about 40 brakemen. These are the guys that work on the railroad and they pull the brakes and they start the strike. But soon it will become a general strike. And this happens after this really horrific accident where one of the young men that had been striking decided that he was going to stand in front of one of the locomotives to try to stop it as it was pulling out of the station, and instead it ran him over. And when this happened, it became really clear to everybody in that not only the B&O company, but in the companies in the industries surrounding it, that this particular company did not care about their workers. So that's when it becomes a general strike. And pretty soon you have not just the B&O railroad company going on strike, but you have other railroad companies going on strike. You have local militias, which were called out to put down the strike, refusing to fire on the striking workers. You have boatmen who are, in the related to the railroad company. There were often these ferry boats and these various boat operators that would unload stuff off of the train. They also went on strike in solidarity with the B&O workers. You had women and children who were coming out and protesting in the streets in solidarity with the B&O workers. Coal miners were also getting involved in this because, of course, it takes coal in order to operate the railroad for the steam engine. And before you know it, it spreads all over the country. 100,000 railroad workers will walk off the job and strike in solidarity with the B&O workers. It will be supported by another 500,000 laborers. So this goes back to the definition of what is a general strike. A general strike is when you have one company that goes on strike, but other companies will step up and support that company, those striking workers, in solidarity. So it becomes a much larger strike on a much bigger scale, and it sends a much more powerful message. So as I said, this is the first general strike in U.S. history, and it is extremely powerful. It is also extremely violent. What will end up happening is about 1,000 people will end up going to jail. As many as 100 deaths will result from this strike. But also very significantly and importantly, moving forward, understand that government is going to not side with the workers in these circumstances, but always side with big business. And in this case, it goes up to the very top level of the federal government, where President Rutherford B. Hayes, who was president at the time that this happens, calls in the army to put down the strike. And that's where a lot of the injuries and deaths will happen, is in these armed confrontations between the striking workers and the military. You can see that the property damage is going to total in the millions of dollars as the striking workers become more and more frustrated. They are destroying property, busting up railroad bridges, etc. So, in the aftermath of the Great Railroad Strike, federal armories, the areas in cities that hold arms and munitions, are going to be set aside specifically to put down these strikes because the government and also big business recognizes that moving forward, there's going to be more of these strikes because the workers are becoming restless and they're becoming unhappy about their unfair working conditions. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to talking about another example of labor union action in the late 19th century. An event called the Haymarket Affair, sometimes also referred to as the Haymarket Riot of May 4th of 1886. So in order to understand the Haymarket Affair, you need to understand why there was a bunch of labor activists in Chicago in May of 1886. A bunch of labor activists convened on Chicago on May 1st of 1886 to hold a demonstration to march in support of an 8-hour workday. And these were members of the AFL, the Knights of Labor, and other labor activists that had converged on Chicago. They ended up having a 45,000 worker parade peacefully down Michigan Avenue in support of the late 8-hour workday, and they chanted 8 hours of work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will. In other words, we just want to be able to have lives. We don't want to have to work 12, 14 hours a day. Now, this particular protest went off without a hitch. It was very peaceful and there were no problems. The problem ended up happening a couple of days later at a McCormick plant. And a McCormick plant was a factory where they made farm equipment. And a bunch of workers went out on strike. And the striking workers were basically confronted by the policemen who ended up opening fire on some of these striking workers. And they end up killing or wounding 6 men simply for striking. Now, the Chicago police force at the time was known to be very anti-labor. But this police brutality then created a second demonstration that will happen on in Haymarket Square on May 4th. And that's where the Haymarket Riot or the Haymarket Affair happens. So May 4th, Haymarket Square protest in support of the McCormick employees and against the police brutality that had killed the striking workers. So the police came in and they ordered the crowd to disperse, and somebody threw a bomb and into the police who were trying to disperse the crowd. After the melee ended, 7 policemen and an unknown number of others will lay dead or injured. News of the Haymarket riot, quote unquote, provoked a nationwide convulsion of fear followed by blind rage, and this was directed against anarchists, labor unions, strikers, immigrants, and the working class in general. So unfortunately, this particular incident ends up backfiring on the labor movement. 8 men will be arrested of this crime of throwing the bomb, none of them directly connected to the bomb throwing, and they stood trial and were found guilty. 4 of them will be executed for this crime. The significance of the Haymarket Affair is that the bomb blast at Haymarket had lasting repercussions, including delivering a death blow to the 8-hour workday movement and the Knights of Labor. So this becomes like the beginning of the end for the Knights of Labor. With the labor movement under attack, many skilled workers turned to the American Federation of Labor, but the nation's unskilled workers remained untouched by the AFL's brand of trade unionism. So unfortunately, it is going to take a while for unskilled laborers to organize again, about another 40 years before unskilled laborers are going to organize again after the Haymarket affair. So it turns out to be a very unfortunate event in the history of union organization in the United States. If you click on the YouTube link, you can also see a little bit more information about this event. Okay, so the last example of labor union movements in the late 19th century that I'm going to talk about is the Pullman Strike. And this brings us into the 1890s. And the Pullman Strike was really a direct result of the Depression of 1893. So there was this big depression in 1893. In fact, it was called the Great Depression until the Depression of the 1930s. And it is going to impact this company town in Chicago, Illinois. And this company town was owned by George Pullman. He was the head of the Pullman train car company. And this company basically built luxury train cars. And he created this town to move his plant and workers away from the snares of the great city. Although the housing was clearly better than in other areas, it was also extremely expensive. Workers could never own their own homes in Pullman either. So basically, the Pullman company town was a place where workers lived and worked. It was a highly desirable job, and a lot of people wanted to work for the Pullman company. But in 1893, when the Depression hit, the Pullman company starts to lay off its workers and cut wages. And eventually, the wages will be cut up to 28% of what they originally were, while the rent will stay the same. Now, in a company town, your rent is taken directly out of your paycheck. So, because your employer also owns the house that you live in. And so that caused a real problem for a lot of the workers because they got not only 28% less of the pay that they were used to getting, but their rent remained the same. So they got significantly less money. So the workers decide that they are going to go on strike. And this strike is going to be led by a man by the name of Eugene Debs, who we're actually going to talk about when we talk about the progressive era. He had founded another union called the American Railway Union, specifically for railroad workers. And the railroad workers in the United States were huge amount of people, tens of thousands of people worked for the railroad companies throughout the United States. And what ends up happening is the American Railway Union is able to get railroad workers from across the country to refuse to pull Pullman railway cars. So there's this huge boycott of the Pullman railway system. Ultimately, this will lead to a huge ceasing of the American railway system. And 90% of the Pullman workers will actually join in on this strike. So basically, the production of Pullman cars at the company basically comes to a halt. Now, like other labor movements that had gone before, this Pullman strike ends up becoming more like a general strike. It will spread to more than 15 railroads and affected 27 states and territories. Although during the actual strike itself, it remained pretty peaceful. However, when the Pullman management reaches out to the federal government to come in and put down the strike, that's when it becomes violent. And the result will be that 34 rail cars will be destroyed, and 34 people will be killed. And you see this image here. And there's this huge fire in the Pullman factory, and it also ends up destroying the adjacent property, which was where the White City from the famous Chicago's World Fair was. So President Cleveland calls in the military to basically put down this strike, and the end result is that the workers are forced to either go back to work, or some of the leaders of the strike are actually fired. So overwhelmingly, these early labor movements and demonstrations are not going to lead to any advancement in conditions for workers across the country. But they show a very important thing, which is that workers are unhappy, that workers are being exploited and taken advantage of. The Pullman Strike also becomes an important moment in U.S. history because it will become the impetus for a national federal holiday, our Labor Day, which lands in September. So if you click on this YouTube link, you will be able to see the origins of Labor Day. All right, so now we're going to turn our attention to talking about life for African Americans, particularly in the South after the end of Reconstruction. So if we go back and remember the timeline, Reconstruction ended in 1877, right? And it ended with the bargain of 1877, which Rutherford B. Hayes agreed to in order basically to become president. So we have to keep in mind that once that happens and the federal troops are withdrawn from the South, life for African Americans becomes really difficult. Things basically go back to normal. Prejudicial laws get put back into place. But one of the most important things that happens in terms of being a major detriment to the African American community in the South is the disenfranchisement movement. So this is the disenfranchisement movement is defined as the movement to try to stop African Americans from voting in the South. So there was a bunch of barriers put in place in order to prevent African Americans from having access to the polls. So if we go back and we think about the 15th Amendment, right? And the 15th Amendment says that you cannot discriminate against the right to vote based on race. Right? That's all it says. It does not say you cannot discriminate on the right to vote based on whether or not you can pay a poll tax or whether or not you can read, right? So there's this big loophole in the 15th Amendment. And so a bunch of Southern legislatures are going to take advantage of that loophole. In fact, we're going to begin by talking about the poll tax. So a poll tax is a tax on the ability to buy voter registration. So in order to register to vote, you had to pay what was called a poll tax. And typically the cost of a poll tax would be anywhere between $1 to $2 per year. So on any given year, say you wanted to register to vote for that year, you would have to go down and pay the poll tax. Now, $1 to $2 doesn't sound like a lot of money to us today, but keep in mind that back then a dollar would have been equivalent to about $19 in today's money. So that could be a financial burden for a lot of people, particularly if money was really tight. And in addition to that, sometimes you had to pay a poll tax 9 months prior to voting. So not only did you have to have this money set aside to pay to register to vote, but you would also have to pay it in advance. So you would have to remember to do it. So it was a huge barrier for a lot of people. I'm going to read off the states that enacted poll tax laws. Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, later on North and South Carolina, Virginia, and Texas. And basically, if those states sound familiar to you and you took my History 17 class, you'll know that that's basically the Confederacy, right? So basically the entire South had these types of laws put in place in order to prevent people from registering to vote. The second major obstacle to voting would have been the literacy tests. And if you click on the link that I've provided here, you will be able to see this link right here, you will be able to see an example of a literacy test. So you click on the link, and then and then you have to click on another link that says see literacy test here, and it will open up an example of a literacy test from the state of Mississippi from 1965. So a lot of these states kept these laws on the books all the way until the Voting Rights Act was passed. So a literacy test was basically a test that you had to take in order to be eligible to register to vote. The example that you will see when you click on that link is a 65 question test, and you'll be able to see the types of questions that were asked. A lot of them are civics type questions about the structure of government and about laws. Some of them are relatively easy and common knowledge, but others are a lot more complicated. So it really was not a fair test, and it was meant to basically dissuade people from registering to vote and to create another barrier. In addition to the literacy tests, and very similar to the literacy tests, were the state constitution quizzes. And these would be, excuse me, quizzes where you would go in and you would be asked to basically recite a part of the state constitution. Mississippi was notorious for this. They would, all the way up until the Voting Rights Act, they would ask Black voters in particular that came into the registrar's office to vote. And that's the other thing to keep in mind, is there was no registering to vote by mail back then. You had to actually go down to the registrar's office and sign up to vote. So anyway, Mississippi would, give Black voters these state constitution quizzes, and if they couldn't pass the quizzes, then they couldn't register to vote. Now, you might say to yourself, well, aren't there a lot of illiterate and poor Southern whites? So wouldn't these laws negatively impact them? And the answer to that is yes, unless you were a state that had what was called a grandfather clause, And the grandfather clause is a clause in the law that said, in the voting laws, that said, if your grandfather could vote, then you were exempt from the constitution quizzes, the literacy tests, and the poll tax. So basically, the people whose grandfathers would have been eligible to vote, right, would have been the white Southerners. So this grandfather clause was enacted in six southern states, 6 of those southern states that I read off to you, and that allowed then for those poor, illiterate white Southerners to vote because they were protected by the grandfather clause. Okay, so now we're going to turn to talking about the rise of Jim Crow and segregation laws in the South. So segregation laws begin to be instituted in the South immediately following Reconstruction in 1877. But the federal government and the Supreme Court is going to acknowledge the legality of segregation in a very famous Supreme Court case, Plessy v. Ferguson. This Supreme Court case was decided in 1896, and essentially what it ruled was that segregation would be legal and constitutional throughout the United States. Their rationale for it, when their opinions were written, was that separate but equal is constitutional under the 14th Amendment. So under the 14th Amendment, there's a provision in the 14th Amendment that says equal protection under the law, right? All people should are guaranteed equal protection under the law. So this particular court case takes that clause in the 14th Amendment and says, well, as long as you have an equal, right, place, right? So if you have a white school and then you have a black school, well, those are hypothetically equal, then it is okay to be separate. Now, as we know, in reality, a lot of these separate facilities for blacks and whites were not equal in nature, right? But that was the legal rationale that was given. So, Plessy v. Ferguson was actually a test case, and this is a test case is when somebody purposely breaks the law in order to test the legality or the constitutionality of said law. And in this particular case, you have a man by the name of Homer Plessy, who lives in New Orleans, Louisiana, who intentionally breaks the law in order to test the segregation laws in Louisiana. And it eventually goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. Why is Plessy v. Ferguson important? Well, Plessy v. Ferguson is important because it allows Jim Crow laws to exist in the South until the 1960s. And I should also say that not just in the South, but segregation and segregation laws existed throughout the United States, including in California. And this particular Supreme Court ruling allows that to happen. So if you click on this link right here, you can see a much more in-depth story of Homer Plessy and his attempt to try to write these segregation laws and how it eventually backfires. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to talking about some examples of African American civil rights activists from the late 19th century. So we oftentimes think of the African American activists from the civil rights movement, from the modern civil rights movement of the 20th century. But I want to introduce you now to Ida B. Wells. And she becomes a very powerful figure in the anti-lynching campaign. Now, lynching was a very serious problem in the late 19th century and even into the 20th century. Lynching, as I think we talked about in chapter 15, is the unlawful hanging of somebody by a vigilante mob. And in this case, African Americans were the overwhelming majority of victims in lynchings throughout the United States. Lynchings actually increased after slavery and continued to increase throughout the late 19th century. What was particularly insidious about lynchings is that people would commit these crimes and then they would never get prosecuted for them. So they would get away with it. And sometimes these crimes were committed in a very public fashion and still nobody was held accountable. So they were very horrific crimes. And oftentimes they were committed because it was assumed that African American men had in some way sexually assaulted a white woman. And this is where Ida B. Wells comes in. In her anti-lynching campaign and in the writings and in the speeches that she gave about it, she particularly attacked this concept that Southern white men were just somehow trying to protect their women. In fact, what she said Southern white men were trying to do was trying to protect their own sense of superiority within their communities, and that they were threatened by the presence of African American males with rights. And so she was really inflammatory in her attack on lynching. She is almost solely responsible for bringing these crimes to the public attention through her speeches, which she gave throughout northern states. And she even went over to Europe and gave speeches on this particular issue. She has a remarkable life. She was very accomplished. Not only did she, run this anti-lynching campaign, but she also was a civil rights activist. She was an activist for women's rights and the right for women to win the right to vote. So she was a very powerful presence, not just in the African American community, but just in America generally. So I want to draw your attention to the YouTube link here and encourage you to watch this. This will give a biographical overview of Ida B. Wells' life, and you will learn much more detail about who she is and what remarkable contribution she gave to American history. Okay, so moving on to talk about two more examples of really interesting and powerful civil rights leaders of the late 19th and early 20th century. On the left-hand side, you see Booker T. Washington, and he was probably the most popular African American of the late 19th century. He was born into slavery and ended up going to a freedmen's school once slaves were emancipated. And while he was at the freedmen's school, he learned a trade, and he found that that was so useful and was so compelled by this idea of learning a trade and becoming economically independent, that he thought that that was the absolute key for African Americans to win the respect of white people. And so he himself opens up the Tuskegee Institute, and he really advocates for this idea of what comes to be known as racial accommodation. And this is this idea that you shouldn't fight for civil rights. Instead, African Americans should somehow earn their rights through hard work, etc. So on the other end of the spectrum, you have W.E.B. Du Bois, who was not born into slavery, was the great-grandson of Elizabeth Freedman, one of the first African Americans to successfully petition for her freedom in Massachusetts. He was raised in Massachusetts, and he was the first African American to graduate Harvard University with a PhD, and he had a PhD in sociology. He later on went on to become a professor in history and sociology, and basically he had a much more sort of modern approach to civil rights. He thought that civil rights should be available and accessible to all people, regardless of what they did with their lives or whether or not they could prove themselves to society. So these two African American men, they were contemporaries. Booker T. Washington was older than Du Bois, but they still lived at the same time, and they had a very public debate over these two issues and these two ways of approaching civil rights. And if you look at page 674 and 675 of your text, you'll see two primary source documents that really illustrate this debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And you can really see how these two sides of the African American community were thinking about civil rights at the time. W.E.B. Du Bois was also a co-founder of the NAACP, a very important African American organization still in existence today. And again, Booker T. Washington, when I say he was really respected, he was especially respected within the white community. And he was the first African American to actually dine at the White House under the invitation of President Theodore Roosevelt. So I will leave you to check out their writings on page 674 and 675 of your text. But remember that both of these men were extremely influential in African American politics and civil rights at the end of the 19th and 20th centuries. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to talking about immigration. And Immigration is a really important topic when we talk about the turn of the 20th century because there are a lot of immigrants that are coming into the United States at this time. So, when this big surge of immigrants begins in 1880 and it lasts until 1920, the demographics of the country are going to transform significantly. And in addition to that, there are going to be a population surge, particularly in the major cities, because a lot of these immigrants are coming to find a life and find economic opportunity in major cities throughout the United States. So as you can see from the slide, about 23 million immigrants will come into the country during this time period, and the concentration of this immigrant surge will happen between 1900 and 1914, where about a million immigrants will come into the United States every year. Now, keep in mind that during this time period, there were no immigration restriction laws, with the exception of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which we are going to talk about in a minute. But that was the only immigration restriction law at this time. So there were no yearly quotas stopping the number of immigrants to come in. So as many immigrants as could make it to the United States and be accepted in would be accepted in. So there was a lot of immigration. Now, what types of immigrants were coming to the United States at this time was primarily European immigrants. As you can see, about 75% of immigration coming into the United States in the early 20th century is European. There are some exceptions to this where, for example, in the West Coast, where there are Chinese and Japanese and Filipino, particularly after the Spanish-American War, which we'll talk about in part 2 of chapter 17, and then Mexican immigration, but that doesn't really start to rise until 1910. After 1910, we see a surge of Mexican immigration into California in the southwestern states, primarily as a reaction to the Mexican Revolution, populist revolution of 1910. So when immigrants would come to the United States, they would be processed at these immigration stations, the most famous of which is Ellis Island, which was located at the base of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. So people would come in and they would basically be registered in a book. Oftentimes their names and their last names in particular would be anglicized. So it would either be easier to spell or easier to say in English. So there's a little bit of a disconnect of the records really from Europe in a lot of cases and America because of that. And at first it was really easy to get through these immigration stations, relatively easy. You would basically register, you would have a health inspection, and then you would be free to go on your own. It got progressively harder as time went on, as we start to see more and more anti-immigrant sentiment arise in the country. And the first major immigration restriction law will be passed in 1917. It's simply called the Immigration Act of 1917. And it will start to put restrictions on the types of people that can come into the United States. And some of them were really kind of, I want to say, un-American restrictions because they were based on things like religion and political beliefs. So, for example, if you were a socialist or you had any kind of radical political ties, maybe you were a communist, you would be banned under the Immigration Act of 1917. So the point is it became more and more restrictive as time went on. So New York's Ellis Island is the most famous example of these immigration processing stations, but there were also examples on the West Coast with Angel Island, and you see a picture there of the dock at Angel Island. Angel Island is an island in the San Francisco Bay, and it was served as an immigration station between 1910 and 1940. It was basically used to process immigrants from the Pacific, and more than 1 million immigrants from the Pacific regions, mostly Asia, were processed there. Basically, they would be um, detained there, again, to register their names, but also to determine their health. Sometimes they would be detained there for quite some time. Um, about 75% of the immigrants that came to Angel Island would have been allowed to enter, but 25% of the immigrants were actually turned away. So that was a higher number than Ellis Island. But basically, you've got immigration processing stations on both coasts. So this is just a table that shows us the percentage of the population of immigrants and their children in U.S. cities by 1920. So if we look at the graph, we can see here, this is New York, and we can see that about 75, maybe a little bit more of the percent of the population of New York were either immigrants or the children of immigrants in 1920. Another very high city, Chicago, right, with over 70%. So if you look at this, this is the 50% mark. So you can see, if you draw a straight line there, that the majority of U.S. cities, over half of the population were immigrants or the children of immigrants by 1920. So, as I mentioned previously, there starts to be a real prejudice against immigrants. And this distinction between who was American and who was not American begins to arise. And it arises between these two groups of people, the quote unquote old immigrants and the new immigrants. Okay, so let's define who are these old immigrants. So the old immigrants are the immigrants that basically arrived in the United States basically prior to 1890. These are people that are primarily from northwestern Europe. They are overwhelmingly Protestant, with the exception of the Irish. So they are from places like England and Scotland, Ireland, Scandinavia, and Germany. Right. So, and they, as I mentioned, they're almost all Protestant with the exception of the Irish. And they begin to think of themselves as more American than these new arrivals. Now, this is kind of an interesting concept because when we think about prejudice, we often think about it as related to race and the color of skin. Obviously, in this case, that doesn't apply because you have Europeans discriminating against other Europeans, right? So it's interesting to think of this idea of whiteness and what that really means. And in the case of these old immigrants, they actually thought of themselves as whiter or more American than these new immigrants. So just an interesting distinction. Now let's talk about who these new immigrants are, right? So the new immigrants, and remember, 75% of the immigrants coming to the country at the turn of the century are from Europe, are mostly from Eastern and Southern Europe. And here I've listed out some rough numbers of people that were coming. You see Italians coming in large numbers, Russians, Polish Jews, Hungarians, Slavic people, right? So you have people from all over these eastern and southern parts of Europe. The majority of these folks are Catholic and Jewish, and so they aren't the typical Protestant that had immigrated to the United States prior. And many of them came to the United States with different political beliefs. And by different, I mean they might have been exposed to the ideas of Marx and some socialist ideas or some communist ideas. And at this time, that was beginning to really be looked down upon, and also be associated with radical political groups like labor unions and things like that, that were seen as being agitators and political activists. So most of these people were fleeing extremely desperate situations, horrific economic problems, discrimination based on their religion, wars, right? So they weren't coming to the United States necessarily because they wanted to, they were coming because they had to. Now, that being said, the U.S. also took advantage of these populations. So there were companies that would send scouts out to these areas of Europe trying to recruit people to come and work in their factories. And oftentimes the stories of the United States would be overly exaggerated, as if the United States was some type of utopia or something, and they would never be poor again. Unfortunately, for most of these new immigrants, they were met with not only extreme poverty, but severe prejudice laid against them once they came to the United States. So it turned out that, whatever they had thought was going to be the reality for them when they got to the U.S., for many of them, it turned out to not be true. So the immigration restriction begins, and it really begins with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So I'll talk about that before I talk about the Immigration Restriction League. So the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 has its roots in intense anti-Chinese sentiment that existed primarily on the West Coast in states like California and also Oregon and Washington, but mostly California. This is where the majority of Chinese people had immigrated to all the way back to the 1850s, where they came for opportunities in the gold fields and for working on the railroad. Ultimately, when they first came to California, or Gold Mountain, as some of them referred to it as, they wanted to eventually return to China. But it turned out that once they got to California, they kind of made their way and ended up, forming communities in Chinatowns in places like San Francisco. And they became a real threat in the minds of a lot of people because they worked very hard, and they were willing to work for less money. And as there starts to be these economic downturns that I have mentioned before, in 1873 and again in 1893, there starts to be a lot of unemployment, and people start to kind of blame the Chinese for taking jobs. So that's really the origin of the anti-Chinese movement. And eventually it will grow so large and influential that it will lead to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. What it basically does is it's the first major immigration act in U.S. history, and it bans new immigration from China. So it basically says if you are Chinese, you are not welcome in the United States unless, and there was only a couple of unlesses in the law. The first was unless you could prove that you have a direct relative in the U.S., right? So if you had a child in the U.S. or you had a parent in the U.S., then you could immigrate. Or if you were somehow being sponsored by an American businessman, like you were his partner or something like that, then you could come in. But for the most part, after 1882, the amount of Chinese immigrants coming into the United States declines significantly. And again, it is It's important because it is the first major immigration act. It's also important because of its cruelty. It is the only immigration act ever passed in American history that specifically singles out an ethnic group, and in this case, the Chinese. And that is really, in many ways, very cruel. So it's the beginning of this movement to try to restrict immigration. And that will also be continued on later on in the century, beginning in the 1890s, with the Immigration Restriction League, which was actually founded in 1894. Basically, what the Immigration Restriction League does is it tries to make that distinction between the old and the new immigrants. And they tried to argue this argument that the new immigrants could not adopt American values. And this is really sort of leading to this, superiority, this idea of superiority of certain people over others. It certainly is related to later eugenics movements and things like that as well. They also argued that the new immigrants were causing social problems, economic problems, any kind of poverty that existed in the United States, or crime and those types of things. Those were all being blamed on the new immigrants by the Immigration Restriction League. So the Immigration Restriction League will ultimately be responsible for the passage of the Immigration Act of 1917, which I mentioned before. But again, this is an organization moving to push anti-immigrant legislation, and that's why they're important. So if you look down here, this link, this will tell you more about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then also just, and your textbook talks about this, photo identification for Chinese will be instituted in 1909, and this is kind of the beginning of photo IDs in the United States. And this was so that Chinese could not be in the country illegally. So again, more sort of direct restrictions aimed at Chinese here in the United States.